Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's panel discussion on empowering residents. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you today, including several familiar faces I'm seeing in the audience. My name is Dana McKinney-White, and I'm an assistant professor here at the Graduate School of Design and in the Department of Urban Planning and Design. And as we continue our exploration of the future of social housing in New England, it's becoming increasingly clear that we are not just talking about buildings and units, but the people, the families, the lives that are held and shaped within these units. Further, it is important to explicitly think about the power, participation, and the right of residents to shape the communities they live in. Calls for new, re-envisioned social housing models are growing louder and more urgent. Rising rents, stagnating wages, displacement risk, and deepening inequities continue to challenge the stability and dignity that housing should provide. But what sets social housing apart isn't only its affordability, it's the aspiration for democratic governance, accountability to its residents, and a commitment for a long-term community control. In this panel, I invite you all to think critically about what meaningful resident engagement looks like and how we can make it central to the policy and implementation of social housing. What does it mean to not just provide affordable housing, but to embed mechanisms of voice and agency into its planning, development, and ongoing management? So to guide this conversation, I'm honored to be joined by three leaders in resident-centered housing. To my left, Peter Fusek is the Secretary-Treasurer of the Connecticut Tenants Union, a growing statewide movement that is organizing for tenant power, stronger protections, and a seat at the table in shaping housing policy. From rent stabilization and good cause eviction policy to tenant opportunity to purchase, the tenant justice movement is building the political foundation for a more equitable housing system. Michael Monti on the other end serves as CEO of the Champlain Housing Trust, one of the nation's most recognized community land trusts, or a CLT. CLTs have shown what it looks like to combine long-term affordability with strong stewardship and resident voice, demonstrating that financial and democratic sustainability go hand in hand. And Mary O'Hara, who's the Executive Vice President of Rock Movement, supports the transformation of manufactured homes communities into resident-owned cooperatives. Through technical assistance and capacity building, her work ensures that communities most vulnerable to displacement can take collective ownership of their land and their future. So together, we're going to work through some prompts, but after which we're going to let them have the mic for a little bit. But how can we balance resident control with financial resilience? What lessons can be drawn from tenant unions, land trusts, and resident-owned communities? And just as importantly, how can we propose new social housing methods that draw strength from established community-led models while also informing and expanding what is already working on the ground? And so please join me in welcoming Peter, Michael, and Mary as they join us in first sharing their respective organizations' work and in conversation on building housing systems that don't just shelter, but uplift, activate, and empower the people that live within them. Peter, would you like to start?
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you both for letting me on this panel with you. I am quite blown away to get to be up here with these two folks. My name is Peter Fusek. I'm the Secretary-Treasurer of the Connecticut Tenants Union, which means on paper that I'm the union's chief financial officer. In practice, it means I wear a whole lot of different hats, including, most excitingly, leading our social housing committee and spearheading the work that our members are doing across the state to implement the tenant union's vision of social housing in Connecticut. Now, we're a member-driven organization of and for the multiracial renters of Connecticut, working to build power across all lines of difference to really shift the equation in the housing market, to shift the balance of power there, and to ensure that in implementing an effective solution to the housing crisis, those of us who are most directly impacted by it are going to have not only a seat at the table, but a really driving influence there. So to that end, we organize across a couple key horizons. On the one hand, we build a base of militant organized members on the chapter level in buildings or complexes where we organize supermajority tenant unions in those localities to bring their landlords to the collective bargaining table to establish collectively bargained leases that, to make a long story short, get the landlord to do what the residents want him to do and to stop doing what they don't want. Now, that's just the first step, though, in how the tenant union movement is going to be instrumental in addressing this housing crisis and the crisis of democracy that we're facing more broadly in this country today. Because beyond that initial measure of control, right, we're here to talk about social housing. And like our friend in the back mentioned, tenant unions are key in pushing for that and pushing for that to happen. Right now, we, in the context of one of our public housing chapters in the Branford Housing Authority, and in the context of a private residential complex in New Haven, we have members, chapters that have brought their landlords to the table, that have taken meaningful control of their complexes, of their homes, cultivated community, built rigorous democratic self-governance structures, and are now moving forward to take the next step to push, in the case of the private context, their landlord to the table to acquire cooperatively and in partnership with an acquisition partner these complexes, to create a new competitive model of permanently affordable, resident-controlled, democratically managed housing that will be able to stick around and sustain itself in the long run.
Am I good?
Yes, Michael should go next, yeah.
Jesus. Okay, not after that. I'm Michael Monti. I'm the CEO of Champlain Housing Trust. Let me just give you a little history. Champlain Housing Trust was created in 1984 as a response to displacement and gentrification that was occurring in Burlington. It was a key to trying to both control the resources of housing in Burlington, to say housing is not a commodity, that all housing should be permanently affordable. And so everything we have done, everything we do actually leans towards permanent affordability. In the range of work that we have done since that time, we really have transitioned from doing everything from homelessness to home ownership to community facilities. We become a community development corporation in many ways. We do land trust, we do shared equity home ownership, but we also have shelters, we also have group homes, we also have, we work on building community facilities for other entities. Altogether, about 3,000 or so apartments of different types and different kinds, 678 or so, more or less, shared equity homes. That number actually is 683, it changes weekly, thank God. So what's important to know is that we were born out of that movement. When Chris asked me to do this, I said, we talked about social housing in Burlington in the 80s, and he says, that's because you had a mayor who said that social was an okay thing to say, and it was. And so we believe strongly in the notion that everything we do, and all the resources that happen both in the city of Burlington and the state of Vermont, actually have to be permanently affordable. Our tax credit program, if you use a 9% tax credit partnership, has to be permanently affordable. We have actually about 60 or so, or 70 or so partnerships that we control that will become owned by us and are permanently affordable. And so we really do that. That's a very important part of everything we do. Let me say, and if I'm going too long, you'll tell me, right? Okay. We are a membership organization. We have 5,000 members. 300 folks will show up to our annual meeting and vote for a board of directors, a third of which are residents. Another third of our board members are actual municipal owners. Interestingly enough, the municipal corporations we merged with another nonprofit back in 2006, and that nonprofit that was created was actually a response to housing authorities not quite getting the resources they need in 1983. You mentioned that date, and so that was a key date for me when I heard it. And that corporation merged with the Community Land Trust to form the Champlain Housing Trust. And so a third of our board members are actually residents. A third of our board members are representatives, more or less, of municipal members. We're very much tied to the local municipalities in Northwest Vermont, Chittenden County, Franklin County, Grand Isle County. And so we believe strongly in membership engagement. We ask our residents what do they need every year. We engage with them on a regular basis in terms of a range of types of communications, in terms of events, in terms of activities. And within our structure, we actually have about 500 or so apartments that are parts of resident-controlled as well as cooperatives. So again, a wider range of different type of housing types, all of them under our rubric, always affordable, all based upon a membership organization that is CHT. I think I'll stop there.
So, is that on? Can you hear me? Great. Mary O'Hara with Rock USA. And Rock USA is a national organization and was launched out of New Hampshire, so has a very New England base, and has actually flourished in New England in a way that we haven't flourished in any other part of the country. So our goal as Rock USA is to scale resident ownership of manufactured home communities. Very different than the social housing that we're talking about in terms of urban areas, because there's very few manufactured home communities, or as they're commonly known in the past, mobile home parks in urban areas. They're mostly on the edge of urban areas. They were mostly developed on the edge of urban areas, and in likely the least attractive parts of town. Not true today. Many of those towns and ex-urban areas have grown out to where those manufactured home communities are, and so now that the land that they're on is much more valuable and attractive, and there's more attention paid to it than there ever was when they were originally developed. So our model of resident ownership, I'm really going to try to focus, because we are talking about resident engagement on the model itself, is a shared equity cooperative model, and we're not doing new development. We are primarily doing preservation. So these communities, the homeowners, the people who live in the communities, own their own home, are entirely responsible for the maintenance of the home, insuring their home, putting on the new roof, putting in a new furnace, all the things. And a landlord or private owner owns the land on which their home sits. They pay rent every month, and in the past, historically, these communities were owned by what we call mom and pop home owners, and they were small businesses, essentially, and the folks lived in the general area where the community was located. That has changed quite a bit, and in recent times, those communities have become targets for real estate investment. And even prior to the new public or private equity investment, there was consolidation of these communities in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s. Hometown America, Sam Zell was one of the largest owners of manufactured home communities in the country. So that consolidation happened early on. When you own your home in a community and someone else owns the land, you're really subject to three very distinctive risks. One is what we're seeing in the most recent years is this steep escalation in rents, which leads to those communities no longer being affordable for the homeowners. And so it leads to displacement very often, and it also leads to their continued value growth, and so this trading of communities where they're bought and sold every 3 to 5 years for more and more money. The second risk is really no ability to control the maintenance of the community itself. So there's a long history of neglect in many of these communities, whether they were owned by investors or by mom and pop owners. If they are a small business and you're keeping your rents low because you know everybody who lives in the community, capital improvements are not generally your first thought. So we're talking about clean water, safe sanitation, a modern electric service in the community, and the folks who live there have no ability to address those things unless their landowner does. And finally, of course, the biggest risk of all is that the land gets sold for redevelopment and folks are technically have to move their home out, but as I'm sure most people here know, these homes are not really mobile. They were called mobile homes for many, many years. They're still called mobile homes, still called trailers in some areas of the country, but in fact, less than 3% of them ever move after they've been placed the first time. So the homeowners who live in these communities are essentially trapped. If their rents go up, and they say, I'm not willing to pay that rent, they could lose everything. The equity stripping by the escalating rents is a real thing for folks who own those homes. Our goal is really to continue the preservation and existence and permanent affordability of these communities. Also to build wealth for the homeowners that live there, and build strong and mutually supportive communities. Rock USA doesn't own anything. We work with homeowners when the community comes up for sale and help them form a cooperative corporation and purchase the community themselves. So I'll stop there and
Thank you. So, out of curiosity, how do you guys, I mean, you all kind of work in very different sectors of these considerations, but how do you guys focus on where to go next? Where do you look for future developments? Where do you look for existing buildings or existing sites that could really use your respective talents? And then once you make that determination, how do you then incorporate your community members? How do you get their buy-in? Feel free to also share examples. It's also quite helpful.
I think from the tenant union perspective, there's two answers to that question. On the one hand, how do we identify where we want to move forward in this tenant union-driven social housing effort, and the other, where we want to be organizing in the first place. And I'll start with that second one briefly, and then I'll get into the first. In terms of choosing where we are organizing, just like all the decisions we make, that really comes down to the democratic decision-making process that facilitates our chapters electing directly accountable representatives who form our governing tenant council along with our statewide officers, myself, the union president and union vice president, who as a body will receive petitions, applications from prospective folks who want to join and affiliate as a local tenant union chapter of Connecticut Tenants Union, and will weigh whether strategically it's a fight that makes sense, right? Whether there are leaders in a given context who are going to be buying into the organizing model, showing up to trainings and turning out their neighbors to them, who are going to drive things forward on the ground, because we're an organization that's 2 years old that has a membership of 1,000 and a staff of 4 or 5. So if it was reliant on the staff to drive that forward, wouldn't be possible, but our resident leaders, our members, drive the project forward, drive the process forward, and so it's really about the people. Are there folks in a given building, in a given context, who want to come together with their neighbors to take control of their home, to cultivate their community, so that everybody living there can really be pursuing flourishing lives? Then there's the question of, is it a huge landlord with a portfolio of 5,000 units across the eastern seaboard, or is it someone with 1,000 units in Connecticut who we can really put significant economic pressure on, because that is the power that a supermajority tenant union has, just like a supermajority labor union has power in opposition to an employer, because they have economic leverage. They have the ability to interrupt the standard operating cash flow of the economic process of rental housing provision in the private market. So those strategic considerations as well, also a factor. Is a building a part of a portfolio we're already organizing within? If so, that power in numbers is emphasized and amplified by having additional folks organizing in a single landlord's portfolio, or even better, a single mortgage bundle. And I think then from the folks who have organized, who have affiliated with Connecticut Tenants Union and had their affiliation accepted by the Tenant Council and have built a militant supermajority union, have brought their landlord to the table, are either in the process of collective bargaining or have won a collectively bargained multi-year lease that provides rent stabilization, that provides certain maintenance controls and assurances. You know, if folks are at that stage of development, and particularly if there's a context where a landlord is going to be refinancing soon, loans are coming to term, et cetera, those are opportunities to move into this next stage of the game and to talk about how we can facilitate resident acquisition or acquisition in partnership with a nonprofit to keep that property not only permanently affordable, but under the control of the residents that those residents have organized to build. I say that, but our one other social housing project is in the context of a housing authority-owned property where the arithmetic was just folks have organized to take control of their property, then they took control of the housing authority board, and so that seemed like the perfect opportunity to really speed run some of this tenant union-driven social housing stuff, and we're working on that there.
So I recognize Peter's effort to actually own the building ultimately, and for Rock USA, that of course is the starting point. I'm going to try and focus on New England. So right now we have approximately 15 new resident-owned communities every year, and it's we're looking at 24,000 households that are living in these resident-owned communities across the country. New England is very unique in the fact that all 6 New England states have passed statutes that enable the homeowners to know that the community is for sale and give them the opportunity to match a third-party offer and purchase the community themselves. We operate through not only our own national staff, but we have a very strong affiliation with what we call our Rock USA network. And in New England, the Cooperative Development Institute and the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund are 2 of our closest affiliates. They provide the technical assistance and the community organizing for any community that finds itself in the situation that the community is for sale. What we're looking at in terms of the future is many more states looking at this chance for opportunity to purchase. So New Mexico, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, there seems to be an interest in what has worked so well, and you can see the difference when you look at that map for the states that have opportunity to purchase. The number of resident-owned communities way outweighs the states where we have to wait until a landowner is interested in selling the community to the residents. In addition, we're seeing more and more communities are sold in portfolios as opposed to as individual communities. The private equity market has seen that they can purchase smaller communities, bundle them, have more sites to then sell at a much higher price. And so we've recently created a subsidiary that is looking to raise the capital to be able to purchase portfolios and then deconsolidate them into individual resident-owned communities. We've also, since 2013, we've had what we call the Rock Association. And it is essentially, I use this word, it's probably not appropriate, but a trade association of resident-owned communities. So we have resident-owned communities in New Hampshire that have been in existence for over 40 years, and everything in between to communities that have just purchased as of last week. And so we have created an association. Every community that's under the Rock USA model is part of the association, and they share peer-to-peer support, their best practices, they mentor one another, and they have started to take action on a political level. And the Rock Association was very instrumental in supporting opportunity to purchase in Maine last year. Maine and Connecticut recently passed opportunity to purchase in 2024. So that's where we come to the Rock movement idea and this thought that as these community owners, their member owners, begin to see that they can leverage their collective power both at the national level and more likely at their state and local level. We're really hoping that the resources that they need for their infrastructure improvement, that clean water, safe sanitation, et cetera, that they begin to get access to some of the resources that are available for other affordable housing. In the past, and in the current in many ways, these communities still suffer from the stigma of being mobile home parks. They are the lowest income homeowners in the country living in these communities. So across Rock USA's portfolio, almost 30% of the portfolio, folks are under 30% of median income. Over 80% are under 80% of median income. So they are the lowest income homeowners that you find, and largely unsubsidized. There's very little public money that we've been able to leverage for support of these communities. And that is, I think, our future is the Rock Association and this effort to really be seen as viable, affordable, and great places to live.
So I would say that broadly we're opportunistic, okay? I would say that clearly. We're a real estate development company, mission-driven, who believes in taking community assets and making permanently affordable. So we will look at any opportunity that comes our way. That's really clear for us. During COVID, we bought 10 motels and converted them because we had that opportunity to do that, and we did it in part. But let me just say this, that the most important thing we do is be responsive to the local municipalities in the area and the state of Vermont and others who come to us and say, we're having an issue with displacement and gentrification in our community. Would you build some additional affordable housing in our community? Would you be willing and able to buy additional existing homes that are out in the community and keep them from becoming gentrified in different ways? And so we are always responding to the various organizations and others in our community to basically do what they ask. We have a process of going through, of course, a board of directors, which I indicated is community controlled, and we have about 40 people in various committees reflecting both real estate, resident services, residents themselves, and various committees who are constantly processing policies, actions in terms of what we should be doing next. So we filter that through that process, but again, always responsive to the community around us.
So, Michael, you mentioned motel conversion, which I think is a really interesting typology that's being kind of leveraged across the country. But we're sitting here in the design school, and I'm curious to know, when you get a project like a motel conversion, what does the process of design look like, and do you have resident voices that are brought into that process?
Sure. There are two doors. We close up one door. We open up a door between the other unit. So now two rooms become one unit. We turn the bathroom into a kitchen, and that also is the living room, and the other room is the bedroom. There's the design. We've done that over and over and over again, and it's worked. And it's worked really well. We have now housed about 600 different households who are formerly homeless, okay, within our portfolio, as a result of being able to do that in a way that really is inexpensive. Now, we also create community gardens. We also try to create community space. We do other things within our properties, so it isn't just doors and windows and elevators and all that. We do a range of things to ensure that community can be built within all our properties, and even in our in our motel conversions, we do the best we can to do that.
I mean, and one thing you just mentioned that just struck me was this notion of homelessness within sort of the social housing framework. 2024 was the worst year on record, since documented record, of homelessness in the United States. We had over 770,000 people who were documented as being unhoused. Michael, you can expand on what you just mentioned, but how are you guys in your own work responding to the homelessness crisis? And are you informing your residents, or are there any stopgaps that you guys are working with within your communities and your organizations?
You want me to continue? Go ahead. You go.
I think that that's a really, really important question, and something that is a key part of our answer in Connecticut Tenants Union is there's plenty of documentation in the literature that as rents increase in a given area, on average, evictions increase. As evictions increase, displacement in mid to long term increases. As displacement increases, more permanent experiences of being unhoused increase. So as long as rent keeps going up, we're not going to solve the housing crisis. We're not going to solve the crisis of mass and increasing homelessness. And I think that then takes us to this question of why social housing and why tenant union organizing and what that is bringing to the table. What that is bringing to the table is the most effective anti-displacement measure that is in existence, right? And I'll give one example of that from this summer and fall. We had a tenant union chapter of ours up in Hartford, bigger building. There was a major fire in that due to long-term deferred maintenance and landlord negligence, and over 100 folks were displaced from that building. They were put in really shoddy, unsafe, unsatisfactory, unlivable temporary housing, quote unquote, by the city for an indeterminate amount of time. These were rooms without even microwaves in them, much less kitchenettes. And folks who had been displaced from their housing were expected to make do with no sense of what follow-up would be, and with no information except for you should probably find somewhere else to live, which is a pretty impossible prospect when you're talking to a group of folks who have been paying maybe $800 a month, living in a place for 20 years in a city that the average rent for a one-bedroom is now $2,000, right? So that is only going to result in mass permanent displacement and an increase in homelessness. But because the folks there who had been displaced were already organized into a tenant union, that did not happen, because it wasn't just left up to the whims of the landlord and the city. There was direct and unyielding pressure from the members and from their allies from every other one of our chapters across the state, because that's what makes it a mass member movement, to demand showing up at City Hall, showing up in Midtown Manhattan in mid-December in pouring, freezing rain to picket outside of a corporate management office for 8 hours, 6 hours, so that they know that they're not getting away with this, that this is not going to be ignored. And as a result, every one of those residents was rehoused in either the same building or another within the landlord's portfolio at comparable rents, with guarantees in many cases of multi-year tenancy. So I think if we want to address the crisis of homelessness, we need to address the crisis of housing, and that comes from challenging who has control of housing, because if housing is controlled predominantly by those who see it as an investment and utilize that investment to make a profit, as opposed to those of us who see housing as housing, shelter, a necessity of our survival, we're going to keep running into the same issue.
Yeah, I would just say that for resident-owned communities, similar to what Peter's saying, it is more about preserving what is already affordable, so as not to cause additional homelessness and not to put pressure on the existing resources, which in many cities and towns, and particularly smaller towns and rural areas, there just isn't any place for people to go. And so we've seen situations, Phoenix, Arizona, they lost 3 communities. They were closed by the community owner who wanted to develop the space for high-end townhouses, and people had lived in these communities for close to 30 years. There were multiple generations of family there. Luckily, the city of Phoenix was under so much pressure, and they did have ARPA money, and they jumped many of these prior homeowners to up on the list, the waiting list, to get into subsidized housing. 98% of these folks had never used a public subsidy before. Only one household was able to remain a homeowner. Everyone else ended up in some type of a subsidized apartment. All of these children had to leave the schools that they were in. Many of the folks who lived in these communities had their own businesses. They were landscapers and painters and did carpentry work and office cleaners. And they were able, because they lived in these communities, to keep all of their equipment and their vans right there on site. And suddenly their businesses were threatened as well. So it was just a real example of this cause of homelessness and why it keeps on increasing. I will say the other interesting thing is I don't think that many of us in the affordable housing development space give the folks who live in communities credit for their recognition and innovation and creativity around things like homelessness. So we have a number of communities who have seen it as their job to address homelessness in their areas and are looking to fill the vacant sites. How can we get new homes in here so that we can provide housing for other folks who need it? How can we work with the churches for them to provide the subsidy, because we don't have the subsidy at the state and local level, in order to create rehab homes that are clearly need of rehab and are no longer habitable, so that we can make those homes available to folks in our community who are homeless. So it's not something that Rock USA is doing, but we're seeing these resident-owned communities taking those kinds of things on as their role in the community, because they know how important their housing is to them.
So I think I mentioned we have a large number of households who are formerly homeless, and I think what we believe strongly that the solution to homelessness is housing, and that permanently supportive housing is a part of that potentially, but also just simply good affordable housing that is stable, where people are secure. That's the key part. That's what we want to do. That's what we want to do more of and most of. And so every time we do housing development, we make sure that there is a certain number of households that have been set aside for people who are homeless. We work at the very level of people who are walking off the street. We have a pod community of 32 pods that has been decently successful in Burlington, that was created with the city of Burlington and with them, which we manage, and we're going to be owning and creating permanently supportive housing at that site. We own a motel that simply does people on a night-by-night basis, which we have state contracts with health centers as well as the state of Vermont. So we've supported other organizations. We have a couple of domestic violence organizations that are our partners, but we own the properties for them on their behalf to make sure that they are, have good shelters. We have a youth shelter. So we do a wide range of things to make sure that homelessness is rare and brief. Having said that, it's startling. It's just amazing. And the level of displacement that is occurring, in part driven by substance abuse disorder and other things, is creating a certain level of havoc overall, I think, in our communities. It's happening in Burlington, as you know, as well. So we have grown our resident services staff to now a total of about 24 people, which is a pretty large number, in response to making sure that people stay housed. So the critical piece is, once people get housing, they need support. And so we have a fairly robust system of making sure that people can remain in our housing and be as successful as possible.
So Mary, a little bit of a non sequitur, but when looking at sort of the site improvements that you were mentioning as being sort of a previous barrier or an issue that these residents were facing, how are they getting involved in the decisions relative to capital improvements on the site? And like, what do capital improvements within a manufactured community look like? Just curious to see sort of like really sort of the tangible sort of aesthetics or, you know, the infrastructures that people are really invested in to kind of make it more of a home beyond their actual structure of their homes.
So it's good. It's a really good question, and it is absolutely where we have turned to the public sector in some ways, and are getting some response. So in terms of resident involvement, from the moment that the community comes up for sale, the homeowners who live there are making all of the decisions. We're essentially putting the options in front of them, providing the financing, providing technical assistance that's paid for through the financing. I think Deborah mentioned the work that she and I used to do in Massachusetts on shared equity cooperatives, and we didn't have anybody to pay for technical assistance. Nobody wanted to pay for it. The lenders didn't want to pay for it. Foundations didn't want to pay for it. It was really, well, you guys are nonprofits. Don't you just do that? And so the model that we've constructed is built the technical assistance support into the financing. So 50 basis points out of the acquisition loan that the homeowners take on because they're paying that debt goes to pay for 10 years of ongoing technical assistance to help that shared equity cooperative do what it needs to do. Before they purchase the community, one of the requirements is all of the due diligence that any buyer of a property would do. So an engineer, a professional civil engineer goes out and does an inspection of all the underlying infrastructure. So, our mantra is that those homeowners know what they're buying before they buy it. And they are seeing a property conditions report. The engineer is required to present what are the immediate health and safety capital improvements that need to be made, and then they have to do a schedule that says this is the remaining useful life of your on-site water system, the remaining useful life of your on-site sewer or septic. If it's a rural community, it's often wells. We've got communities that have their own water treatment plants on site because that's what's required. Certainly with the storms, drainage has become an absolutely critical on-site, and trees in New England. I will always say that if you get 3 resident rock leaders in a room together, it'll be about 7 minutes and they will be talking about trees. Because there's so much, they're so expensive, there's so many, they have mostly not been maintained, and people care very deeply about them. And so, and it's a huge expense. So they get that property conditions report. The lender is going to require them to save monthly to meet that capital improvement schedule. And then every year, the members actually, there's about 5 things, I think I actually wrote them down. The members elect a board of directors, but there's certain powers that the entire member ownership holds to their own selves, and one of those is an annual approval of the capital improvements that will take place and the money that's going to come out of their budget in order to cover those. They also approve an annual budget, so any rent increase is approved by a quorum of the membership. They elect the board of directors. They are the only ones that have the right to remove a director, and they adopt their own bylaws, their own community rules, and 3 policies that the board must follow: conflict of interest, procurement, and a code of ethics. So they are very, very much in control of the kinds of improvements that are made. And there are others. I mean, some communities do have community space, and I'm just going to support what was said earlier. Resident-owned communities, the difference if they have an on-site community space for folks to get together and meet, and their ability then to exercise their democracy the way that they need to and want to is up to exponentially. And it's so important, and it's one of the things that we look to try to find the financing to provide for those. And then, some communities have playgrounds. There's a few that have a pool, but most of the common area is garden space, community space, and passive collective space, I would say, for the most part.
Great, thank you. So I would love to talk to you guys more, but I'm going to open it up to the floor. Do we have any questions? Right over here. Mike Runner.
Thanks very much. My name is Dan Denver. I'm a co-chair of Reclaim Rhode Island. We're a housing justice group in the Ocean State. We're big advocates of the public developer. Our main work is on tenant organizing, and we're really grateful to have the Connecticut Tenants Union and SEIU 1199-NE as really our organizing mentors as we've gotten deeper and deeper into that work. And my question is to get a little bit deeper into how those two things connect. I know you've touched on that a bit, Peter, but how can socializing, decommodifying housing be integrated into the work of tenant organizing? What sort of policies can we look at that would allow tenants, but also perhaps public housing authorities and nonprofits to take control of private market housing, particularly in terms of the work we're doing? I'm thinking about real scofflaw slumlords that just refuse to deal with major code infractions despite minimum housing inspectors coming by again and again and again. What would it look like for the public sector, nonprofits, or tenants directly to basically take those properties out of those slumlords' hands through receivership or whatever and to decommodify them? Thanks.
Now, isn't that the question? Thank you very much, Dan. I think that something that Mary mentioned policy-wise is TOPA, COPA, Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, Community Opportunity to Purchase Act. While it's very exciting that a version of that passed in Connecticut, it is limited to manufactured home owners or tenants rather than tenants of multifamily buildings, single-family rentals, or larger complexes. But that kind of legislation will be quite instrumental in allowing this kind of process to happen at scale in a replicable manner, particularly if it's paired with funding mechanisms that are accessible to residents looking to acquire their properties and that are not necessarily on the same kind of timelines that currently a Department of Housing or Connecticut Housing Finance Authority mortgage loan, subsidized mortgage, is on, which is an unchanging timeline that you have to follow regardless of the timeline of the organizing itself, which doesn't always match up. But I think beyond those two statewide policy goals that I think are quite integral to this being scaled up, I think on a local level, something that we've been very interested in and active around is housing code enforcement. Because if you have a code enforcement agency that if a tenant knows that the agency even exists and if they are not concerned about retaliation such that they go and report a violation to the agency and maybe they get an inspection and maybe they get a follow-up inspection, and if the issue hasn't been addressed, then maybe the landlord gets fined $100 a day. And oftentimes, as with many fines in the world of regulatory bodies, that's just the cost of doing business, right? But something that we've pushed for and have worked with a couple municipalities in different parts of Connecticut to get passed is having things like a $1,000 fine per violation per unit per day. So that's something that can ultimately lead to a lien being placed on the property, making it, even in the absence of TOPA or COPA legislation, much more favorable for a sale to residents, municipality, a community land trust, or any other entity that's going to decommodify it and take it off the for-profit market. But I think that those are tools that can either compel landlords to address deferred maintenance, to revert from a MO of negligence to actually addressing the issues because it becomes more expensive not to, or pushes them to the table to become a seller, or some combination of the two. So I think that on the more localized level, statewide, TOPA, COPA, with funding, and of course, because we're currently pushing to pass it in the state legislature in Connecticut, just cause eviction protections so that people can organize without fear of retaliation, without possibility of legal recourse in the form of no-fault eviction.
Hi, I'm Jenny. I'm a planning consultant, and I'm working currently with the Community Land Trust in Boston. So we've heard a lot that land is just so expensive, and I'm just curious where you see possibilities or solutions around containing the cost of land, and in my dream, decreasing the cost of land so that land trusts and housing authorities can be true competitors in trying to take the land out of the private market.
Oh, geez. Once again, a tough question, I think. I don't think there's a really easy solution in the current state of capitalism. Okay? Straightforward. It's not. We have, in the past, looked at things like eminent domain on behalf of a municipality who then could work with an existing either housing authority or a land trust. That's also a fairly big leap to get to that place. But we have created, one of the things we had to do somewhere in the late 80s was actually establish a new urban renewal plan, which was startling because everybody hated urban renewal. We hated urban renewal. But we created urban renewal again in order to give us some powers to take land. And we began to, in fact, do that in different ways. And so that might be something to explore, but I don't think it's an easy thing. And often enough we are working with municipalities or communities where we are accessing free land, just simply as a first start to being able to develop it. But I think the cost of land is something we have to take into consideration in everything we do. I don't know if anybody has a brilliant idea. I'll take it.
Okay.
Mary might.
There you go. I do think, I'm just watching these communities that are multi-million-dollar pieces of land. And what is supporting the homeowner's purchase, of course, is their rents. But they're borrowing 110% loan-to-value financing, and they're carrying that debt. So I think financing is a huge aspect of it. That's the place where we have to start. And I think that CDFIs have done an amazing job at being flexible, innovative, acting quickly. And Rock USA has an internal CDFI. We have a national CDFI. It's Rock USA Capital. And oh, what's a CDFI, Tanya asks? It's a community development financial institution. And actually, it should give support to everyone who's interested in social housing because way back when, they were called community loan funds. And they were considered these oh, wow, that's a nice idea. Little pilot thing these people are going to try to do, right? And then slowly we became a movement. Community loan funds became a movement, which is sort of where we're at, right? People are talking social housing movement. And now we're an industry. And we got changed from community loan funds to community development financial institutions. And we did get the federal government to actually create the CDFI fund. And it's probably one of the most effective and efficient uses of taxpayer money that you've ever seen. It comes out of the Treasury Department of all places, and they actually provide balance sheet equity to these CDFI funds, and they are mission-driven, nonprofit, 501c3 lenders who are delivering capital where previously no capital was available. And CDFIs, here in Boston, it's the Blue Hub is the largest CDFI. Somebody was here earlier from LEAF, which is a CDFI that funds cooperatives. There's the Cooperative Fund of the Northeast. And like I said, Rock USA Capital is a CDFI. We just passed over $1 billion in financing for manufactured home communities. That's not all out of Rock USA Capital, but it's from the multiple CDFIs who are lending to these resident-owned communities across the country. And I think that the ability to then attract socially responsible investment, impact investment to CDFIs can help drive down the cost of that debt. Rock USA Capital has created a pool in Colorado, $50 million pool, and the people that are involved in it are the HFA, the local Department of Housing and Community Development, the Public Health Foundation put up a huge amount of money for it, several banks, an insurance company, and it's because these folks are recognizing that housing is critical to everything else that they want to do, and so they are willing to invest, and they get a return, but they're seeing the benefit of low cost capital and what that can do to drive something like a community land trust that's citywide and needs to purchase land in the city.
I just had another thought. One of the things we do is there's inclusionary zoning in Burlington in various forms or in the surrounding communities. We will often be co-developers with a private developer on a piece of land where we're actually getting a piece of land pretty cheap, if not downright free. And in that opportunity are able to do our shared equity home ownership or our permanently affordable rental housing, co-developing with a private developer. We've done that a half a dozen times at this point. And that's one way of us being able to get access to land which is too expensive for us to purchase.
And I just want to say financing, it can be structured so many ways for real estate. It could be interest only for a period of time. You can stretch out the term so that the monthly payments are low enough until you get the housing put on the property and then you refinance. I mean, there's just a myriad of ways in which I'll say housing finance agencies and CDFIs and other mission-driven lenders have made it possible to take capital and provide it in a way that works for what it is that you're trying to do. So,
I see the red or...
Yeah, thank you. My name is Ines. I'm a visiting professor from Spain here at the planning department at the GSD. And about the issue of land, one idea that we have in our legislation in Spain, of course, we are a capitalist society, but there is a social function to private property of real estate. And this social function of private property allows for certain things, for instance, about protection of heritage and so on, but it also allows for issues such as something that is being introduced recently in a number of land use legislations in several Spanish regions, which is, and this relates to the debate on zoning reform here, it's a tool that allows for a kind of land reserves or land zoning of land for facilities that is used for housing, for social housing, for certain specific groups maybe or under certain conditions, but the classification or zoning of land as facilities for housing, which implies a lower price because it's under the umbrella of facility, but the land is going to be used for housing. So that's a new tool that is being introduced in a number of land use legislations in Spain. That's one idea that might be, maybe, I don't know. Here it is.
Okay, maybe one really quick question, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Hi, I think this question's for Mary. Rock USA seems to be really responding to the challenge of private investors who are basically extracting value for housing, from housing and from communities for their own investment returns. I just recently heard about a company called HomeTap, which wants to have which is proposing a shared equity model that they will be essentially private, quiet investors, and that when you go and sell your house, they'll take the percentage that they invested 20 years ago or whatever. So how do we respond to this financialization of housing and the need for housing, for dwellings and for shelter and for community uses and family uses, and the role that private investors are playing, and I think having an impact on prices and pricing us out of our communities?
Well, I mean, I think you're pointing to, and I know we're close to time, so I'll say, I think you're pointing to the fact that, this question about housing for shelter or housing as a commodity, right? That's where we're at. There's private equity is making everything a commodity. So we have to decide as a society, how we're going to respond to that overall. I think in terms of there's a number of pieces of legislation that have been proposed to try and keep private investment out of single-family homes, particularly in this idea that there's certain cities where the percentage of single-family homes that are owned by investors and the competition for an individual to buy a home, versus an investor. So I think it's a good question and one that we absolutely have to work on. And I think people understanding that is really important because, of course, we all, everybody was looking at where their equity was going and appreciation was going. Anybody who was already in the club, if you were in the home ownership club, it was like, I bought my home for $150 and now it's worth, so I think we have to really look at ourselves on that front as well.
Well, I'm sorry to cut the conversation short, but we are going to move into our next panel, which will be led by my colleague Rachel Weber on expanding financial support. So it's a really great segue. Thank you.